Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel BandysBooks, and today we are here with another Talk About It Thursday. Today we're going to be talking about DNFing books. I know I've seen quite a few videos on this subject lately, people discussing why they do or don't DNF books. Today we're going to go over the pros and cons of DNFing books, and then I'm going to tell you about my own personal process for DNFing books. Honestly, I don't know if there's really a right answer in terms of whether you should or shouldn't DNF a book. For me, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, and I think everyone should really ultimately do what's best for them. But let's talk about it. So first of all, a DNF means do not finish. For me personally, a DNF means that you don't ever intend to finish the book. So for me, setting a book aside and going like, I'm not vibing with this right now, but I might read it again later, is not a DNF. That's just like a little bit of a break to give myself time to be in the right place for that book. A DNF for me is I'm never touching this stupid book again. I hate it so much. I never want to see it ever again. I never want to give it a second chance. I'm not interested. Bye-bye. So for me, a DNF is a very permanent state, but I know that some people view DNFing as a more flexible thing, like the process that I just described, they see that as DNFing. So for the purposes of this video, when I'm talking about DNFing, I mean literally never picking that book back up again. Not I've set it aside until a better time. Just completely done with it. Throw it in the garbage for all I care. I think that in this conversation about DNFing, I think there are both pros and cons to DNFing, and I think it's important to weigh each of them and then kind of figure out what you value in terms of both the pros and cons. So some of the pros of DNFing books are, 1, it clears books off your shelf much quicker. So if you're DNFing books much more frequently, that gets rid of a lot more of the books sitting on your shelf because you check it out, you don't like it, you toss it aside and you pick something up new. You don't spend long periods of time trying to slog through books that you're not enjoying. It doesn't slow you down, and so you're able to move things on and off your shelf at a much faster rate. It also frees you up from potentially having to leave negative reviews. Now, some people do leave reviews if they DNF, and a lot of people don't. So a lot of people feel that it's unfair to leave a review if you haven't read the book. And so potentially if you agree with that scenario, then it frees you up from having to write a review about a book. Not that you have to write a review anyways, but you know what I mean. It's like no pressure to write that review because you didn't finish the book. It's also a good way to protect yourself from a reading slump. Have you ever read a book that was so bad that you just didn't want to read anything after for a while? You were just like, I need a break. Give me, some serial killer TV shows on Netflix so I can cleanse my mind of what I've just read. Because that can happen. Sometimes you read stuff that's so bad, it just like kind of makes you feel not inspired to read for a while. So I think DNFing helps prevent people from getting into slumps sometimes. And most importantly, DNFing books frequently keeps you from wasting your time. You don't have to spend copious amounts of time on something you're not enjoying. You get to keep reading about things that are positive and fun. You get to read what you want, and you get to spend your time how you want. And there's no like rules about, I've got to push through this because whatever. So I think for me, out of all of those pros, the most convincing reason for DNFing is protecting your time. I think time is a very valuable asset, and I think most of us struggle to find enough time in the day. So why waste that time reading crappy books? Now, onto the cons of DNFing. So the first con of DNFing is that you don't receive closure on the books that you've started. Some people care about this more than others. I'm one of those people that it really bugs me when I don't know how a book finished. If it's like the first 30 or 40 pages and I'm not that invested, I don't care. But if I've read at least 50% of the book, then even if it's a really bad book, I'm still curious about how it ends. So I very much relate to this. But I know for some people, it's not that big a deal. They just, okay, on to the next one. But that could be a con. Another con is that you could stay in your comfort zone. Sometimes the books that we're DNFing are the books that push us the most outside of our comfort zone and cause us to grow a bit. Sometimes, like for me personally, I've picked up books that were like experimental fiction and have like unusual formats or an unusual writing style or really difficult characters. And for me, sometimes those books are not the most enjoyable reads. Sometimes I don't like them at all. In fact, several experimental fictions that I've read have ended up being some of my lowest rated books. However, I do think that there's growth in reading books like this. I think that sometimes literature should be challenging. I think sometimes literature should be difficult. I think sometimes literature should be uncomfortable. And if every time I experience one of those emotions that I DNF the book, I would lose out on all that growing and learning if I DNF'd every time that I felt a little bit uncomfortable or like I didn't like something, then I feel like personally I would miss out on a lot of that growth and a lot of that learning that I do when I pick up these difficult books. And for me, the most compelling con for DNFing books is that you might miss good books. I've had this happen a multitude of times where I have picked up a book, started reading it, and for whatever reason just could not get into it at the time. I read it and was like, oh, I'm not vibing with the characters, my mind's wandering too much, I'm too tired, something's not right, right? And then I've set that book down and picked it up at a different time, read it, and then devoured it, and been like, oh my gosh, this is so good. In fact, one of my all-time favorite books, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, happened exactly like that. I tried to read it. I found it really boring and slow. I was having a really hard time getting into it. I wasn't enjoying it, but my mom insisted that it was an amazing book. And my mom usually has pretty good taste in books. So instead of just outright DNFing it and throwing it away, I said, okay, let me try this again later when I'm in a different place. So I put it down. I waited a couple months. I picked it back up. I struggled again and I put it back down and I said, I'm going to give it one more try. The third time that I picked it up, I don't know what it was, but I was in a different place. I maybe was less stressed, less on my plate, but I devoured it and I ended up loving it and it became one of my all-time favorite books. And that's not the only time that that's happened to me. There have been quite a few times where I was in danger of DNFing a book at a certain point and it ended up being a 4 or a 5-star read. I think one of the most recent examples I have is The Priory of the Orange Tree. I really struggled to get into The Priory of the Orange Tree. The first 200 or 300 pages was a slog for me with all the setup of the different characters. And I'm an avid fantasy reader. I'm somebody that likes big, chunky fantasy series. I don't mind all the setup. There's just something about The Priory that was dragging for me. I just didn't feel invested. I didn't feel a lot of attachment towards the characters. There was a lot of setup and not a lot of action. But then at the halfway point in that book, all of a sudden this amazing plot comes together and stuff starts happening. And then I was so glad that I persevered through that book. So for me, that's probably the biggest con against DNFing. So that said, should you DNF or not? Well, I think that it just depends on the situation. If you're reading something that is experimental or something that's meant to challenge you or something about a difficult subject, perhaps it might be worth persevering through. So for example, say that you pick up a book about the Holocaust and you're reading it and it's brutal and it's hard and you're not enjoying reading it. Do you just DNF it because it's about a difficult subject and you're not enjoying it? Or is there maybe some value that you're going to get out of persevering through it? Versus like, hey, I picked up, something that was like just a fun read, not necessarily something that has some content or some sort of challenge or something that I might learn from, but just, like say like a serial romance novel from the airport, and you get into it and you're like, I don't really love this. Are you going to really miss out if you put that book down? Probably not. If anything, you're probably going to save yourself time and you can go pick another book that you might enjoy more, right? So I think that's kind of how I weigh my DNFs. So I have a couple ways that I assess them. So my DNF process is a 2-part process. So first, again, I look at, is this book challenging me in some way? If it's experimental fiction, if it's a subject that's challenging for me, but I know that I'm going to learn from it, if it's something that's going to spur growth, things like that are legitimate reasons for me to continue to work through a book. That said, it doesn't mean that it's worth struggling through something, even if it's a meaningful book, if you're really absolutely miserable and hating it. So for me, if I am in a book and I'm really, really hating it, I'm not loving it at all, then I do what I mentioned before. I put the book down, I give myself a couple months, I pick it back up, I try to read some more. If I'm still not interested, I put it back down and I give it a third try at some other point. If on the third try it's still not working, then for me, I feel like I've given it a fair shake and it's just not the type of book that I'm going to enjoy. I do have this process because, like I said, I've had it happen many, many times where I thought I was going to DNF a book and I ended up loving it. So I want to be fair. I think one other thing that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about the DNF process is being fair to authors. Authors, editors, publishers spend so much time putting books together, and I really want to give each author a fair shake. Of course, I'm not going to torture myself and make myself miserable, forcing myself to slog through something that I ultimately am not enjoying, but I do want to make sure I'm giving an author a fair try. And especially if I feel like my mood, my stress levels, the things that are on my plate, my work life, any of that stuff is impacting my feelings towards a book, then is it really fair for me to DNF it, right? If I'm DNFing it genuinely because I just don't like the book, there's something terrible about it, then sure. But sometimes, like I said, I think for everyone, our stress levels, our life balance, things like that can get in the way of our enjoyment of books. I try to be cognizant of, am I reacting to this book fairly, or is this because of something that's going on internally? And if I do feel like it is something going on internally, then I try to give myself some grace and I try to put the book aside, give myself some time and get to a better place and then retry it, because sometimes a change in perspective changes everything. So that's my whole DNF process. Now, what about you? I can't really tell you what you should do with your books. I will tell you that I think there's value in challenging yourself sometimes, but I also think that there's value in protecting your time. It's a limited commodity, as I mentioned before, and you absolutely have the right to spend it whatever way you want. And in particular, since reading for most people is a hobby and not a job, I totally understand wanting to just read for enjoyment and not push yourself through a bunch of awful books that you're not enjoying. So whatever you do, I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I think as long as you're comfortable with your DNFing methods, then more power to you. And yeah, that's this video. I know this was a short one, not a super contentious one. I hope you liked it still the same. If you did, hit the thumbs up button. Comment down below and let me know, do you DNF books? And if you do you have a whole process like I do, or do you just toss them to the side? And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as that notification bell so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.